Hello and welcome to yet another video, and in this video it is something different because I'll be sharing with you guys my general camera settings that I use for my photography, whether it's my landscape photography, cityscape photography, portraits, what have you. I'll be sharing my general settings here on this video. So next time when any one of you asks, I can just email or send this or just link this video to you guys. Anyway, without further ado, let's get into the video. So in this video, I'll be sharing with you guys my settings for both mirrorless and DSLRs. Actually, it's pretty much almost the same for the most part, except for the first point, which is the autofocusing system. For the autofocusing system in DSLRs, I tend to stick with the single point AF because I feel like it's the most accurate AF, whether I'm using like a Nikon D4, D5, Canon 1DX, 5D Mark III, 5D Mark IV, D800, it's all like the same. I feel safer using like a single point AF, and with the joystick and also not as many autofocusing points as mirrorless cameras has, it's also very fast to navigate through anyway, and I usually have no problem with using single point AF on DSLRs, whether I'm shooting landscape or cityscape or what have you. And yeah, I think that's just the main difference between DSLR and mirrorless for me. On mirrorless, I tend to use like the smallest zone AF, and most of the time I tend to stick with continuous AF as well, or AI servo. And it's just that on mirrorless cameras nowadays, the sensors are way more accurate and way more predictable where it wants to focus on, and it's usually very consistent anyway. So in most cases it really helps a lot to keep it at AI servo or AF continuous, simply because if I suddenly switch to street photography or suddenly switch to portrait photography, it's always nice, and especially if I'm using like an 85 1.2 lens, when the shallow depth of field is so shallow that even a slight movement of you and or your subject actually makes a huge difference from focusing on the eye or focusing on the tip of the nose, just like by simply moving just a tiny bit really makes a huge difference. So it really saved me a lot of time using AI servo on mirrorless cameras, especially when I'm using like 50 1.4, 85 1.2, things like that. But otherwise, now let me talk about the more general settings, like the mode. The mode that I generally use on my cameras, whether it's DSLRs or mirrorless, I tend to use, well, 95% of the time I tend to use the Aperture Priority, simply because I love being able to control my depth of field. So let's say if I'm switching between portraits to landscape, I can just switch from maybe f1.2 all the way to f14. And in landscape or in cityscapes or what have you that requires me to have really deep depth of field, like when everything is in focus, I switch between f9 and f14. Now this really depends on which lens, and you have to figure this out yourself for your lenses that you use, which is the sweet spot. Some lenses is f8, some lenses is f9, some lenses is f14. But if I'm shooting any scene that has like a direct sunlight, I tend to go for like f11, f13, f14, most of the time f14, because I really like that sweet sun starburst effect in my image. And on this particular lens that I most of the time use for those type of shots, f14 is like a super sweet spot to get like a really nice elegant sun starburst effect. But if I'm just shooting in a cloudy day or like an overcast day or a day or like any scene that doesn't have a direct light source or a direct sunlight into the camera, then especially in the daytime, then I would just keep it at f9 or f10. So yeah, it really just doesn't matter that much. And being an Aperture Priority, it's also really nice and quick because the camera calculates the shutter speed, and I also leave my ISO to auto. That being said, I have set limitations for ISO and shutter speed. Now if you're looking for a new camera or upgrading to another camera, make sure that your camera also has some sort of limitation settings for your aperture, ISO, and shutter speed, simply because it's really a time saver and also a lifesaver in many cases, because there are situations where the camera cannot predict everything that's going to happen, and you just have to set the limit to. For example, if I'm shooting in, I don't know, some sort of wildlife settings or some sort of like portrait settings, but it's like already blue hour, so it passes the golden hour already, and naturally the shutter speed would also drop in order to have a longer exposure into, or longer light time into the sensor, so that the camera can actually capture at the desired exposure that you set it to. Obviously you need to, well, I usually set the limitation for the aperture and ISO so my image don't get too noisy, or the shutter speed won't get too slow that, you know, holding an 85 1.2 can actually cause some sort of like blurriness or shakiness to the image. Then my next setting is actually picture profile. Now on all of my cameras I tend to have it at standard, like for example, yeah, on Canon it's standard, on Fuji is obviously Provia, simply because I mainly shoot RAW and I like to have as natural color science as possible. And you know, in most situations the standard profile is actually the most natural one, like for general purpose, because some cameras actually has the neutral profile settings, but even that is sometimes a bit too flat for me. I just like to have a little bit of contrast, but in the same time everything looks standard. Yeah. And talking about RAW, yes, I mainly shoot RAW because then I can always change like incrementally different settings, or adjust different, like ever so slightly different color temperature in Lightroom or in other editing software that I'm using. It's just nicer than using JPEG, because with JPEG, if you're just moving the slider to even maybe 1% to the warmth or 1% to the magenta or cool, then, you know, it feels like it's showing a huge effect for everything. Whereas if you're just adjusting 1 or 2% in raw images, it really adjusts really slightly to the sweet spot. So there's also a huge difference there. And now on to my next point, which is white balance. Now, white balance is actually something that's tricky because with Canon and Nikon, I'm pretty much spoiled with their white balancing system that I can most of the time leave to auto, and it's really accurate and also really, really consistent. You know, something like the D850, the 5D Mark III, 5D Mark IV, EOS R, the Z7, the Z6, also the Mark II of those versions, they're all very, very consistent with the white balance. But when it comes to like Fuji, I tend to really set a dedicated white balance to either like cloudy or daylight, simply because, well, sometimes I want the image to look a bit warm but consistently warm, and sometimes I want the image to look, it's not too warm but slightly cool as well. So yeah, it's just really about the consistency. And I think with a lot of more modern cameras, especially like from Canon, Nikon, Sony, a lot of the white balance is really consistent, so I wouldn't be too worried. But if I'm doing a lot of commercial shoot, then definitely pick one and stick with it, so it's more consistent that way. My next point actually doesn't have to do a lot with the actual image quality or image settings that comes out, but I feel like, you know, sometimes as a person who does cityscape photography as well as street photography for fun as well, I have the setting beep turned off. You know how sometimes with a lot of cameras, default out of the box, it just beeps or beep twice when the autofocus is actually confirmed. And to me, that's actually a bit annoying, and I don't need that because I can see the green box or the blue box or whatever the box color turns into when the camera is in focus. I can see that with like through the screen or through the viewfinder, so I don't need like confirmation beep. Some people likes it, I personally don't, and if I'm doing street photography, it can be annoying, and your subject could also, you know, notice that you're trying to photograph them. So I generally have that setting turned off. And now on to the next point, which is the metering mode. And the metering mode, to a lot of people, it's not really important, but to many photographers, it is quite important because it actually allows your camera to change the, you know, how it meters or evaluate different scenarios and gives you like best suitable settings for your camera to take pictures. I mainly use the evaluative metering, so it will just try to evaluate the entire scene plus your subject and everything. Sometimes I do keep it to partial, and very seldomly spot. Spot metering is very, very crucial for portrait photography, but since a lot of times I'm shooting against the sunlight with portraits or having some sort of direct light source into the lens anyway, it actually helps me more to use evaluative metering rather than spot metering. But if you're just like, you know, shooting outdoors, even photography, trying to get some portraits, it's still nice to actually go for spot metering. I can see why a lot of people would go for spot metering in that case. For me, it's just a really like safe zone for me in general to stick with evaluative metering, because at least it's metering for the whole scene. That's not saying that spot metering is bad. Spot metering is really good if you're doing again, like really focusing on like specific subjects, like a single portrait, like a single person, or some sort of like animal or whatever subject that is more important in the scene than the rest of the scene. And it's just more important to have that perfectly exposed than the rest of the scene. But yeah, in most cases I keep it to evaluative metering. And now on to the very last point, which I should actually have mentioned in my autofocusing system preference point, and that is actually the IAF. In more modern cameras, like the mirrorless cameras, I tend to leave it on unless if I'm using Fuji cameras. Fuji cameras can be very tricky and it gets distracted very easily. A lot of times it actually recognizes my iMac as a face or a tree branch as a face when, you know, there's an actual human face in front of it. It's actually quite scary thinking about it, but yeah, it's a little bit messed up. But with most other camera systems like Nikon, Canon, and Sony, they're actually very accurate. So being a, you know, mainly a Canon shooter, I mainly keep the IAF turned on, and it's just very accurate, because a lot of times I would have human face in there intentionally if I wanted to. And again, it really is a lifesaver when I'm shooting portraits, for example, and just have like some sort of eye detection that detects the eye and it just locks onto the eye. And this is even more important again if I'm using the f1.2, f1.4 lenses, where even slight movement can actually determines which part of your face or the subject's face is focused onto. Because back in the early DSLR days, like my 5D Mark II, my early 7Ds, you know, like with the f1.2 lenses, if my subject moved even like a few millimeters, it's just changed from the eye to maybe like the tip of the nose or this part of the nose, and that is very distracting. And if you're on location, you cannot really judge that through like, you know, the 3-inch screen, regardless of how detailed that is. But yeah, I think that's pretty much it for general camera settings that I mainly use for my cameras to take my pictures for cityscape, portraits, what have you. If I'm missing anything, if you would like to know anything, please feel free to just ask me in the comment section down below. If you need a free photography guidebook though, I have it free on my website. The link is also down in the description below. But yeah, I hope you can actually take something away from this video, if not a lot, then a little. Anyway, thank you again for watching. Stay safe, have fun shooting. Bye for now.